So I am happy to have with us here Professor Nora Newcombe from Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Professor Newcombe is a Laura H. Cornell Professor of Psychology at Temple University and serves as the president of the International Mind-Brain Education Society. Professor Newcombe served as the past president of the Federation of Association in Brain and Behavior Sciences, as editor of Psychological Science and Public Interest, and as an associate editor of Cognitive Research, Principles and Implications. She got many honors, and she has multiple publications. Honors include Distinguished Scientific Contributions Award from the Society of Research in Child Development, the William James Fellow Award from the APS, the Howard Crosby Warren Medal from the Society of Experimental Psychologists, the George Miller Award, and the G. Stanley Hall Award from the APA, the Award of the Distinguished Service to Psychological Sciences, also from APA, and the Women in Cognitive Science Mentor Award. She deserves them all. Professor Newcombe research is focused on spatial development and the development of episodic and autobiographical memory. We are very happy to have her with us here today, and we look forward to hear what you have to say. We thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Of course, it would be so much better to be together in person, but it's wonderful that we can visit remotely. And I was just chatting with Esther about how there is not much research on cognitive development in Israel. I myself do sort of general cognitive science, but very much from a developmental perspective. And I think there's a lot about the field of cognitive development that people who do sort of ordinary cognitive science and cognitive psychology kind of view from afar. And so I'm going to give you a bit of a tour of some of the ways that developmentalists think about theory. The title of this lecture takes off from the fact that right as the pandemic was closing in last year, I had been invited to give the Gibson lecture at Cornell, which was sadly canceled and has never happened. So this is sort of what I was going to say. And that's a picture there of Mrs. Gibson. The perceptual theory that the Gibsons developed is pretty well known in cognitive science, I think, and stresses this idea of affordances and is important, I think, still in some areas and to some extent when people talk about embodied cognition. And their approach to development was very much that it was all about just the pickup of information, the interaction with the world, as this little guy is doing right here when he's rolling this round puzzle piece. That puzzle piece affords rolling, and that would give rise to mental rotation, except they didn't really believe in anything sort of mental or representative. And that's in strong contrast, obviously, to Jean Piaget, who thought that mental rotation appeared very late and it was late constructed, and also perspective taking with the famous Three Mountains task, not till 10 or so. And I'm going to talk about mental rotation, perspective taking, and also spatial reorientation in the sort of larger navigable world in the context of those historical approaches, but also others. So what I want to do is to talk about what I call a modern constructivism, which is sort of kind of like Piaget, but not really. It jettisons stages, it jettisons the idea that there's very, very weak starting points in infancy, but it still embraces the idea of the active child trying to make sense of his or her world. So there's strong starting points, there's major change, but the change is not stage-like. And it does begin with these kinds of affordances that actually both the Gibsons and Piaget talked about when, sensory motor kind of representations. And I'll illustrate that with regard to mental rotation and perspective taking, and then switch a little bit to talk about how we divide up the mind into domains or fields that we can really tractably study. And there I'll talk about spatial reorientation, which has been the focus of a big debate where nativists, notably Liz Spelke, have claimed that the ability to reorient is innate. So I'll be spelling all of this out, but I want to begin with an overview of this sort of eclectic, let's say, view of development that I have. So I want to begin in terms of this nativism empiricism debate by saying that I believe that everybody today is a Darwinist. And, you know, people like Steve Pinker are fond of talking about, oh, the blank slate, those people belong in the, believe in the blank slate. I don't really think anyone does. You'd have to tell me who does. I think we all believe in a mind that's crafted by evolution, so no one has the Darwinian high ground. So I just want to get that off my chest, so to speak, to start with. Where I think there is disagreement, and here is where I would invoke Bill Greeno and his idea of experience expectancy, is that the way you can solve, if you're mother evolution, the problem of how to get kids off the ground in thinking is that you can endow them with what they're going to need to inevitably learn what they need to learn to survive and to reproduce from the input that can be expected. So you don't need to build in innate ideas. You don't have to have representations that are innate. You can build a learner that will learn from this expectable input. And that's where the Gibsons come in, because they pointed out that there's a lot of rich structure in the real world, that perceptual redundancies and correlations exist that will allow for this experience expected learning. A new thing today is that we're getting much better at quantifying that input. For instance, with, cameras that babies wear on their heads that give us access to what their visual world is like. And then we can specify a model of what it is that that input is and what the learning procedures would be that have to operate over that input in order to learn. Which is where the Reverend Bayes comes in, because humans do have impressive capacities, which probably are inborn, for statistical learning and for a kind of Bayesian thinking. And this addresses one of the main problems. If you don't know about this nativist argument, don't worry about it, but they keep talking about profligate associationism. And it is a real issue. You can't just associate every damn thing with every other damn thing and expect to get anywhere. But of course, the idea of prepared learning is a very old idea in psychology. Marty Seligman was talking about this in the 1960s. And the Bayesian way of thinking, where you come in with priors, in that sense, is another part of these strong starting points that I'm talking about. There's a wonderful book written by a team of authors. These are three who are sadly no longer with us: Liz Bates, Jeff Elman, and Annette Karmeloff Smith, Rethinking Innateness, which I recommend if you have never read it, which really gives us a picture of this richly structured world and this capacity for probabilistic thinking that can interact all the way down the various sort of levels of analysis, behavioral, neural, computational, to create the kinds of development that we see. And Piaget does come into this picture because action does, I believe, play a key role in development. And that's both physical action, which is part of the embodied cognition perspective, if you will, but also cognitive action, this impulse that he always talked about to basically do what social psychologists call reduced dissonance. You want the world to make sense. Sheldon White, Shep White, was a professor of mine at Harvard. He's not super well known, but he always talked about development as learning. A lot of developmentalists say, oh, development, learning, they're different. No, they're sort of the same, except development studies learning as the learner is rapidly changing. So learning is often thought of in terms of an adult animal, adult human, like, because they don't change that much. Learning is learning, but in development, the learner is changing. Another idea, and this comes from dynamic systems theory, as Esther Thielen and Linda Smith outlined it in their book in the 1990s, is that development can seem qualitative. It can seem stage-like. If you contrast a 2-year-old with an 8-year-old, they look really different. It seems like maybe you could talk about them being at different stages. But that doesn't mean that when you have a high granularity of observation, when you look in detail and you look day by day by day, you see very, very continuous change. And it also doesn't mean that all the changes hang together in those kind of structured stages that Piaget talked about. And I think kind of last, I just want to talk about, levels of analysis, whether you talk about David Marr or Konrad Lorenz or Aristotle, there's all these different levels at which we need to analyze phenomena. And I don't think any of those need to be privileged. So that was pretty rapid. It's my overview of an eclectic approach to development that I think gets us much further than the debates if you belong to the school, the church, the cult of Piaget or nativists or whatever. I think all of these ideas can really sit together. So I've already accomplished my number one goal, but now I want to put some flesh on those bones by talking about strong starting points and major change, and I'll begin with mental rotation. So any cognitive psychologist, I think, knows about Shepard and Metzler and these blocks and imagining them rotating and judging if they're congruent or could be congruent, and how that is related in terms of time to the angle of rotation. Very soon after Roger... Hello? Sorry, is there a question or? Oh, okay, sorry. So very soon after that, Gloria Marmer, who sort of did a little bit of work and then went on to a different career and didn't stay with development, did a piece of work, and then later Estes followed, David Estes. But to suggest that young children could also mentally rotate as judged by those kind of Shepard criteria. So with mirror image stimuli that are sort of more kid-friendly, like these ice cream cones with bites out of them or bears with their hands up, are they the same or are they mirror images when they're rotated? And what you see here is adults, and that is at the bottom. That's linear. It's a little hard to see it's linear because adults are very fast. Then you have 5-year-olds and they're linear, and 4-year-olds and they're linear. So everybody said, oh, look, it's so early. And at the time, that kind of passed for nativism because 4-year-olds were so little, even though now we kind of think they're so big. But what I want to draw your attention to is, first of all, how slow they are. They're really slow. Secondly, look at those error bars. They're really variable. And thirdly, although it's not on this graph, lots of 4-year-olds couldn't pass Gloria Marmer's training. They got kicked out of the experiment for failure to understand at all what it was they were supposed to do. So I think we need to be cautious about what 4-year-olds are doing. Now, I'm going to tell you more about that in a minute. But first, I also want to draw on this idea of action as being important, not just in infancy, but even later. And this comes from a paper that was done by Andrea Frick, who later came to postdoc with me, but this was part of her doctoral work in Zurich. And she used these falling figures that you had to judge if they would or wouldn't fit into the puzzle as they fell. It's a kind of Tetris. And could you rotate that to fit, rotate it in the plane to fit? And adults at the bottom actually are linear, although they look very flat, but that's because they're so quick. And the same actually for 11-year-olds and then 8-year-olds. All of these are, she's plotting it where you should get a V shape, not linear, because she's mirror imaging it on either side of 0. And what you see for 5-year-olds is, again, and this is 5-year-olds, not 4-year-olds. They're very slow and they are V-shaped. But what she also was doing with the 5 and the 8, with everyone, but she was having everyone rotate a rotor under the desk, and it was either in the direction that would be the most advantageous for the rotation or against what would be most advantageous for the duration. And what she found was that there was a real cost to having to do that for both the 5-year-olds who were slow anyway, and also for the 8-year-olds who kind of were looking kind of adult, but they still were very much using this action kind of system to accomplish mental rotation. Actually, when we look at neural work, at fMRI work, even adults sometimes show motor activation when they're doing mental rotation tasks. They don't always, but when you look in their brain, you get the idea that they can overcome it in behavior. They're not showing the cost here, but there is still some motor interaction. When Andrea came to postdoc with me, we really tried to see if we could get younger preschool kids, 3, 4, even the 5-year-olds, to do better. And we used a variant of her puzzle task. And we also used what we thought might be more fun for the kids, which is a ghost puzzle. And these ghosts come in um, mirror image versions, as well as the versions you see here. And the issue was whether or not they can fit in a puzzle cutout area. And to cut the long story short, what we found across those two studies with either the ghosts, these are the ghost data points, or the puzzle piece data points, this is not check marks, these are puzzle pieces, is that 3.5-year-olds and 4-year-olds cannot do this task above chance. We tried so hard. And the 4.5 and the 5-year-olds start to be above chance, but you can see they're not that good. The 5.5-year-olds are, behaving a little better. So this does seem to be something that's late emerging. But wait a minute, you say, isn't it in infants? I thought I read about some looking time experiments where babies can do this. And in fact, Moore and Johnson and Quinn and Libin in '08 published back-to-back articles in Psychological Science, one using Shepard-Metzler type block figures that oscillate in front of the babies, and then they are shown a mirror image version. They're shown either the left one rotating or the right one rotating, and then in habituation through that arc. And then in test, they see a different arc, either with the mirror image or the actual object. And they look longer at the one that is the mirror image. Now, only the boys look longer, and sex differences I'll come back to later. And Quinn and Libin, similarly with a different paradigm, found early success, but only among boys. So first off, it's not that clear that babies can do it, only boy babies can do it, although I don't believe that. But also, why is it that babies can, quote unquote, do it if 5-year-olds can barely begin to? Like, that is something that Rachel Clifton talked about a lot. How can, toddlers and preschoolers be so dumb if babies are so smart? This is a big problem with infant habituation studies. So one possibility is that the Moore and Johnson, you see a very big oscillation, and then it picks up right at the point that it would have taken off from. So you're shown a lot of information. You're not shown what the Shepard-Metzler test, you're shown a static presentation. This is it. Rotate in your head. I'm not doing anything for you. So there's a difference here in methodology. It also could be just the dependent variable, looking times versus an actual judgment. And to preview, I think it's the second. But looking at this issue of extrapolation versus static presentation takes us to some work also done in Zurich, also done as doctoral work in Zurich by someone who later came to postdoc with me, Wenke Möhring, who's now back in Europe. She just took up a new job actually in Germany. But she did this work with mental rotation in 6-month-old infants with a static presentation, either of a flat, looks kind of like a P, or on the other side, there's kind of looks like a Q, and it's three-dimensional, and it's yellow and red, and both of them are shown either in the P with the other side being the Q, or the Q being the flat blue with the other side being the very interesting P. But of course, babies only see one of those. And shown in various orientations going up and down behind a screen. So the issue is whether the wrong one emerges from behind the screen, do the babies look longer? Now, crucially, Wenke used 2 conditions with the babies. In one, the baby, remember, only 6-month-old, not that good at grasping, well, grasping with his left hand, is being handed this figure and gets to explore it himself. In the observation condition, there's glass there. So you can see this baby actually bimanually would like to grasp this figure, but the baby doesn't get to do that. Instead, the experimenter turns it for the baby, giving baby the view of both sides. So in both cases, they get the view of both sides. In one case, it's self-controlled, plus you have the tactile stimulation. In the other case, it's just observation. And what you find, you're looking for a difference between possible and impossible appearances, is that 6-month-olds do show that looking time effect, actually the girls as well as the boys, if they got to explore. But if they only observed, they do not show this effect. With the 10-month-olds, and now we're only looking at observation, just observing is enough, which suggests the possibility that, oh, and this is a new data point, actually, 8-month-olds who cannot succeed. So somewhere over 4 months of activity in which you explore, this, I could turn it and it looks different, and I wonder, can I turn it back? And that's enough to get you able to think about this internally and to show an effect in looking time. But remember, you still can't show it in judgment. So my belief is that, and this actually is a very sweeping problem in my view with infant looking time research, what is manifest early in looking time may be the seeds of adult competence or 6-year-old competence, but it isn't it. It still has a long way to go to become it, if you want to see real judgment. So just briefly, back to those sex differences. Stella Lourenco and her group have recently published a meta-analysis of sex differences in mental rotation, which show that the sex differences, which ultimately are actually quite large in adults, are very, very small in 3-year-olds. And for infants, we don't have a meta-analysis, but there are many null effects in terms of sex differences. So I just don't believe in the sex differences. I think babies of both sexes have the seeds of competence, probably, although that needs to be demonstrated in more longitudinal work, but they don't have the ability to really accurately judge mental rotation. So they can recognize a violation, but they need experience to propel change, to actively choose the right solution. So I want to turn now to perspective taking, which of course, Piaget talked some about mental rotation, but his work on perspective taking and the 3 mountains task is much more famous, and use it to illustrate strong starting points, but substantial change, and also a little bit parsing the mind, because I'm going to tell you that mental rotation and perspective taking are quite different. Computationally, they're not necessarily different. You could write a program to turn one into the other pretty easily. But I believe they're different psychologically, in neurally and behaviorally. One concerns mental rotation, concerns what you can do with your hand, turning things. And perspective taking concerns the different views you get of landscape, of terrain, as you move around it and among it. This is a proposed division that I and others have suggested between types of spatial skills, so that are either within an object and concern the structure of an object, or concern the spatial relations among and between objects. And perspective taking dissociates from mental rotation. This is the point about parsing the brain. And that's been shown behaviorally in a bunch of references that I have up there, and also neurally by Neil Burgess's group in a very elegant fMRI experiment where people look virtually at a table that contains an array of objects, and they're told either to imagine the table rotating or to imagine themselves walking around the table. And as a function of what they were instructed to imagine doing, the bits of their brain that are related to navigation are activated when they're imagining walking, but not when they're imagining mental rotation. Mental rotation much more involves the intraparietal sulcus, as opposed to the bits of the brain like hippocampus, retrosplenial cortex, parahippocampal place area, that are relevant to navigation. So what's computationally equivalent is not always neurally and behaviorally equivalent. There are various tests of perspective taking, including a version of the 3 mountains test called the 4 mountains test, and a very widely used test by Mary Hegarty, the spatial orientation test, as well as a test that Andrea Frick, Venke Mooring, and I made, and a test that Lynn Libben made recently, and this is just being submitted for publication. We did some psychometric work on it. Psychometrics is sometimes thought of as boring, but I've come to think of it as fascinating, because otherwise you don't know what you're measuring. And what we found once we refined these tests was that perspective taking can be distinguished by the tests from mental rotation once you control for IQ and working memory. Now, in terms of this strong starting points and later change, a long time ago, John Flavel talked about level 1 and level 2 perspective taking. So there's early ability to take perspective if all you mean is, I know that you see something different from what I see. So this is actually 2 photographs side by side of my grandson, Callan, who's now 5.5, but he was then 1.5. And he's going to be showing a mask book where you can, adopt another persona via a mask. And he's holding the book, and then he holds it up so that the mask bit faces the observer. This isn't because my grandson is brilliant. This is although he is, but this is something that 1.5-year-olds can do. So in a certain sense, and this is now this isn't in looking time, this isn't actually doing something, they can take perspective. But what they cannot do is really compute exactly what. It's all line of sight kind of. But they can't work out something like the 3 mountains task, which Piaget showed with his version of it isn't passed until 8 or 10. Now, a long time ago, with Jane Ellen Huttenlocher, who had pioneered work on this so-called item question, I showed that kids as young as 3 or 4 can actually ask answer a question like, if you were sitting over there in Piaget's chair, what mountain would be in front of you? They cannot pick the right picture, though, which is the way Piaget did this. He showed 4 pictures. And the trouble with showing 4 pictures is there's a lot of interference. You're sitting in a room where only one view is the one you can see, and you've encoded it with regard to everything else in the room. So there's a lot of inhibition of this egocentric choice that's required to choose the correct picture, which I believe is this one. But if all you have to say is what's in front, you can say, oh, it's the dark green one. If you do the task the way Piaget did it in terms of picture choice, and in a format that requires this kind of inhibition as well as computation, then the Frick, Murring, and Newcombe paper showed that in fact success is pretty late. It's only at 8, which is pretty much like Piaget, that kids start to get passably good at it. If you make it just a bit harder, adults still fail lots of items. So that's why it can be a psychometric test of individual differences. So not only is development prolonged, it's variable. In the end, as we all know, some adults are better at some things than other adults are. Back to sex differences. I, spearheaded by Alina Nazareth and joined by Daniel Voyer, who's a meta-analyst of sex differences, he's done a lot of this work, have looked at navigation skills. And we do find sex differences overall in adults. They're nothing like as big as the ones you find for mental rotation, but they're definitely significant. And task variation, actually, we couldn't tell that it mattered, although probably it does, but there starts to be too few studies to really have a good look at it. But crucially, in terms of development, as with the Lourenco and meta-analysis of mental rotation, this is not a normal y-axis. It's just the size of the effect. So for studies of children less than 13 years, the effect size for the sex differences is about 0.1 whatever, 0.13 or something. So the sex differences for kids who are pre-adolescent are quite small, and they appear later. So my last topic is spatial reorientation. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I want to engage head on with one of the, I think, most sort of widely known. If you don't know a lot about the development of spatial cognition, I find you often have heard about Liz Spelke's claims about the geometric module, which she means in a pretty hard Fedorian sense, a domain-specific, innately specified, hardwired, etc. module. And in her core knowledge perspective, this geometric module is one of the 5. I think other lists have more or fewer, but one of a small number of modules that she makes pretty strong nativist claims for. So what is this geometric module? What is spatial reorientation? It actually started with work with rodents. Here's a little toy mouse. And later the work expanded to be with children. But whether it's a rodent or a child, they're in a rectangular enclosure with 2 long walls and 2 short walls. And therefore there's 2 congruent corners, long wall to the left or short wall, or vice versa. And if you hide something in a container in one of the corners, then if there is no other information, then you go to one of the 2 congruent corners, if you remember the geometry. If there is some added information, like different colors of the walls, only one wall has a distinctive color, you can select the correct corner. You know, the long white wall is to the left of the short blue wall. And what was found was that rodents, once they're disoriented, rodents you just put in a box and spin the box. Kids you gently pick up and hide their eyes and sing Ring Around a Rosie. Once you deprive them of those sort of body-based cues, toddlers, like rodents, do show what makes sense to me, what I think is totally true, that they have remembered the geometry of the room. They divide their searches pretty evenly between the C for correct corner and the R for reversed corner. If you add a colored wall, though, that doesn't help them. So the toddlers are unable to use information other than geometry. And that's where the modular claim comes in, that you can't pierce this encapsulated geometric module. And of course, adults can do this. In this particular experiment, 96% to 4%, and who knows what was up with that adult who chose the wrong corner. Seems a little crazy. So the question is, for a nativist, if this is a module, then how do you become unencapsulated? So Spelke's view is that it's language. Nativists always need something to account for change, and what they tend to invoke is something, I think, simple, that sort of, to use the Latin term, deus or dea, if you want to be a feminist, ex machina. So for her, it's language. Around 5 or 6, children acquire productive control of the terms left and right, and that's when they become able to succeed. But we showed pretty early on that the finding itself is specific to very, very small rooms. What I have not told you so far is that the room that Spelke used was the size of a closet. It was not a room. It was not navigational. And when you expand its area by 4, which doesn't make it a super big room, it makes it a small bedroom, not it's not a big room. Toddlers as young as 18 months show success. And that was basically replicated, arguably in a more elegant design where the walls are movable, so everything is constant. And you contrast for 4-year-olds, the small room with the larger room. They succeed in the large one, not in the small one. And we also showed in an octagon that it's a true reorientation. It's not just next to the blue wall, not next to the blue wall. It's this colored wall. This one is red, organizes the whole room. So even 3-year-olds are above chance in distinguishing the 3 all white congruent corners in an octagon. And they can also use a feature in a circle to distinguish among hiding boxes. Furthermore, brief training leads young children to succeed even in the small room. So these 3 kinds of developmental theory that I'm seeing are a modern nativism, which I buy that there are strong starts. I buy representation. I do not buy that the environment plays a minor role, that it's only learning language, and that there's not that much change, and that basically there's a kind of passive organism. I mean, maybe there's some activity in learning language, but it's fairly passive. I also don't buy modern empiricism like really dynamic systems is, which has very weak starts, which doesn't believe in ultimate representation, and which kind of does have a passive organism view, I think. But the environment does play a major role and there is substantial change. So this modern constructivism I see as, strong starts, unlike Piaget, but not representational starts. But coming to be representational, the environment is playing a major role, and there is substantial change, and there is an active organism. And I see I have 10 minutes left, but actually I was so eager to get to the questions that really is the end. So maybe I should have taken more time, but I'm happy to expand on any of the points. But I do want to thank the National Science Foundation for decades of funding, including a wonderful decade of funding to the Spatial Intelligence and Learning Center from 2006 to 2016, and also to remember my friend and collaborator, Jane Ellen Hutlocker, with whom I did a lot of this work. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this very illuminating talk and with perspective, I would say. We have questions. The way we take questions is if you use your raise hand icon. Your raise hand icon, depending on the version of the Zoom that you have, it's either in the reactions or in the participants. Usually it's in the reactions. You can raise your hand to ask questions if you want, or in the participants, it's in the 3 dots. You can use the raise hand option that might be there. So if there are questions we are waiting to have, I can see Hodaya. Yes. Okay, we will begin with Hodaya and then we go on.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, thank you for this wonderful talk. I have a question that might not be specific for your talk, but it's about something that you mentioned about perspective taking and level 1 and level 2 perspective taking. And I was wondering, what do you think about this separation, and like, in terms of like, you talked about mental rotation and perspective taking from the perspective of spatial and not from the mental point of view, which some researchers would say is level 2 of perspective taking. So I would love to have your perspective about it, about like this separation, or what do you think about it?
So are you thinking about sort of social, affective, other people's feelings and thoughts? Is that what the question is?
I think yes, I am, because in research, I'm interested in perspective taking. In research, I saw this debate about whether or not level 1 perspective taking, about like the visual part of perspective taking, does include mentalizing about like the thoughts and intentions of other people. And I'm wondering about those critiques and
Yeah.
to what extent they are valid.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's a couple of strands here. The theory of mind research has kind of emphasized this big change that supposedly occurs about 4 years or so of age. And then there's been, as in all domains, the developmentalists look at these claims of sort of earlier success. And I have, although I don't do theory of mind research myself, the same point of view about that as I have about what I did talk about, which is that there are these earlier precursors, but that is not to say that babies have the whole thing. So when people like René Baillargeon claim that theory of mind is present at 12 and 18 months, I say no. There's something, I guess, although it's currently the focus of a big many babies project, I think, to see how well it replicates, because there's some debate about that. But anyway, assuming it does replicate, I think of it as a precursor, not as the full-blown thing. But there's another question that's there, which is, to what extent does reading other people's feelings and thoughts have to do with knowing something about what they see? And actually, a few years ago, I would have told you I think the answer is nothing, that spatial perspective taking is just that it's an accident that we use the term perspective taking to apply to both of them. And that spatial is somehow special and different from anything theory of mind or other people's thoughts and feelings. I'm increasingly unsure about that. A graduate student of mine is working on it, and there are very definite divergent points of view. Actually, interestingly, someone who usually is pretty much a nativist, Rebecca Sachs, would agree with the idea that it's separate, because she really thinks theory of mind is very neurally separate and its own kind of faculty and so on and so forth. There's a pretty big debate about it when you look closely at the literature. There are kinds of correlations, both behavioral correlations and sort of tapping the same sort of neural areas. And this graduate student is engaged in doing both a meta-analysis of the overlapping areas of the brain, which we think may show, although she hasn't gotten the answer yet. She's almost ready to hit the button on this ALE analysis, but anyway, might be because of shared attentional demands, which would be, I think, a little different from how most people think about it, but we'll see. But also just behaviorally. So that's a convoluted reply to say it's a really, really good question.
Thank you. I would love to maybe contact her and see her work if that's possible, because yeah, I'm into this literature and I'm really not sure about whether or not we can refer to this visual perspective taking as mentalizing about thoughts and intention. It's really, it really disturbs me.
Well, I don't know if you're going to register for the remote Cognitive Neuroscience Society meetings, but Maria Brucato is her name. She's the one on the slides who is the first author of the psychometric analysis of the spatial perspective taking tests. I mean, I literally mean she's about ready to hit a button, because all the work on this neural meta-analysis is in gathering the studies and the activation areas and all this kind of thing. And then you basically hit a button and there'll be a poster there soon.
Okay.
So if you haven't registered, you might think to, and if not, just contact her at Temple, Maria Brucato.
I wrote for myself. Thank you very much.
Great.
Okay. Jonathan Goshen will ask a question, and then I can see Maury has, and Daniel, you want to ask as well, don't you? Okay, so that will be the order. Okay, Jonathan.
Hi there. Fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for coming all the way to Zoom to give us this talk.
No jet lag.
No jet lag. So in my mind, there were two parts of the talk. I know you parsed it in different ways, and I'm not able to put the two parts together. Okay. One was the amazing introduction where you put the whole world together, tried to talk about experience, expectant learning, and explained how that goes together with all sorts of fantastic ideas, and put together Mars and his view, and a conceptually fascinating talk. And then there were empirical studies. Mm-hmm. And what I didn't understand is whether these empirical studies about different fields related to that introduction. Did they somehow strengthen it? Did they weaken it? Or were they completely independent?
I do not see them as independent. I think that the phenomena you look at and the interpretations you make of those phenomena are deeply influenced by theory. I think most people now would agree. And so the interpretation.
Could you give me a taste of one of the theorizing that was driven by your one of the interpretations that was driven by your theorizing?
So my skepticism that infant looking time tells us about the full-blown adult competency comes out of the theoretical perspective that I have. If you're a nativist, you often jump to the conclusion that what you see in an infant looking time experiment is a full-blown adult competence. And you see that claim again and again and again in the developmental literature. So that's just one example, but for me, it's a very important one. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yeah.
I could push for another example, but there are other people standing online.
Another example, let's see. Well, also, I mean, I think coming in with this idea that, and this isn't even an idea, I believe that like tons of research over the 70s, 80s into the early 90s showed that the structuralist aspect of Piaget is just untenable. Stages in the sense that Piaget proposed are out. And once you take that point of view, you're going to look for much more gradual change. So I think the talk embodied that sense of gradual change, and also a sense of comfort with task dependency. So the idea that, you know, adults show some trace of needing to have motor activation in some mental rotation tasks, even though they don't necessarily show interference when they're turning a wheel under the desk, is this idea of continuity kind of under the hood. And so that's part of my perspective also.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Maury, will you go on now?
Yes, I guess it might be a sort of a follow.
Oops, you muted yourself inadvertently.
Let's
Okay.
try again. This might be a follow-up to Jonathan's question. Again, looking at the difference between the looking results and the full-fledged mental representation, and looking back at the title of your talk, where it was Affordances and Representation, would it be a generalization to say that perhaps there's a developmental trend such that early capabilities are more Gibsonian, based more on affordances, and as time goes on, they become more and more representational?
Yes, that's what I think.
That
and that's
was
also
your
one
message.
of the
Okay, so I understood.
that's one of the key ideas that I take from actually Annette Karmeloff-Smith, not in the book that she wrote as part of that team, but her own book. So this idea of representational redescription, I think, is a really important part of development.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah,
I agree.
Okay, Daniel, please unmute yourself. Yes.
So I was wondering whether...
We can't hear you, Daniel. Please come closer to the mic.
I was wondering whether it might be that the difference between the manual rotation enabling the mental rotation and not, could that be related to differential maturation of ventral and dorsal visual streams?
You know, it might be. Developmental cognitive neuroscience is coming along, but I don't think we know whether or not that is the case. There's a little bit of work on it, but not a lot. But for sure, it could be.
Gal, will you be asking a question? Gal?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Probably you can see me now?
Now I can.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for a great talk. I had a question about the meta-analysis on navigation that you showed, that basically suggests that early on there aren't gender differences, but later, and correct me if I'm wrong, I saw that there is this linear trend for small gender difference, maybe. Did I understand that correctly?
That's in the mental rotation meta-analysis.
Oh, okay.
For the navigation one, it's kind of weird because the adolescent group is sort of a stick out, like they have a big difference, but there's not many studies. So the navigation literature is a little less kind of mature than the mental rotation literature, because mental rotation has the advantage of everybody so loved Roger Shepard, they did more or less the same paradigm again and again and again, and there's a ton of data. Whereas the paradigms in navigation are all very different. And so it's even hard to really know what studies to identify, and the task variations, like I said, are probably more important than we were able to discern and so on. So it's glitchy. I don't know if it's linear or not.
Okay, because the question I had in that respect, and I guess it's a more general question, how can you differentiate between this gradual, continuous cognitive development in terms of maybe there is some ongoing maturation on the biological level, neural level, and the influences of the environment? Because the more experiences you have and the more encouragement you get, right? Supposedly navigation, right? Women can't park or navigate and men can, which is, not true. But how do you differentiate these two effects? Is it possible experimentally?
Well, obviously it's very difficult, but I mean, I think you start with sort of like the kind of work that I was talking about when I got the question about dorsal and ventral visual stream, with looking at what even descriptively actually are the neural changes, and then starting to look at how if it looks like they could relate, do they relate? But always keeping in mind that what you see in the brain is not a given. I mean, it might be maturational, and some of it probably is, but the brain is also sculpted by experience.
Right.
So you also have to identify experiential factors and to be quite specific. That's why I briefly mentioned, although I don't do this sort of research with the head-mounted cameras, getting an idea of the input, I think, is really very important and very challenging. So with enough work, you start to know which variables to identify and to try to relate. Sadly, I think a lot of people will focus on experience and sort of poo-poo the brain, or focus on the brain and poo-poo experience. So bringing them together is challenging. Another field I work in is episodic memory development, and there I think we're getting to a point that's a little more mature, where we know more about both the neural substrates of episodic memory and some of the relevant experiences, like how adults the memory talk, what did you do when you went to the zoo? You remember we saw the cheetah, that kind of, and there's a whole rich body of work on that. So actually in a project that I have an NIH grant for now, we're trying to bring those together. In the spatial domain, I think it's going to be harder, because what you really want are actually GPS data on where they're going. And that's a little intrusive, and I don't know if kids, will people agree? On the other hand, some people like to track their kids because they're worried about, oh, they'll be abducted or something. So maybe there is a way to get it. There is some work actually in more hunting foraging groups where they did do GPS tracking, which is starting to give us a much richer picture of what the experiential sex differences might be. And some of those actually are linked to the emergence of adolescence, in that seems like it might be the time, and people have talked about this for a while, but there's starting to be data at which, even with little kids, parents tend to let their boys roam a little further than the girls, because they're more protective of the girls. But with adolescence, that gets more marked, and the girls themselves experience it. And presumably, frankly, it's a safety issue, that they're worried about physical and sexual assault, and therefore they keep to the well-known paths and sort of closer to the village. So this is a sort of, I usually do pretty cold cognition, but this is a pretty hot topic when you think about what effect it could have on navigation and navigational abilities.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a evolutionary explanation together with the
right, but it's one you're
experience.
pretty aware of. I mean, I spend a lot of time when I do get to go to new places and go to conferences, actually trying to remember where's north, where's the ocean, this kind of thing. I'm in this hotel. If I, wanted to get out, where's the main entrance, just as an exercise. But I'm telling you, if I know the way from the hotel to a restaurant, I'm going to retrace my route, because I don't know, like if I try to take a more direct route, maybe I go in a bad neighborhood. I have no illusions about that.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so I'm so happy that you had so much time for questions because it allows me to ask a question as well.
Okay.
So we have done some work on mirror drawing tasks in children. And it's not only our results, but also others that 5-year-olds can do a mirror drawing task while 7-year-olds reassuringly can do it. So the question is, how does that fall with your data about mental rotation in the different ages and what's the difference here? This is just one comment and the question. And the other is about the representational redescription of Camille Smith's work. That she used the non-existent object task that I used, the drawing of the non-existent object task, which I use as well. And there you have to distinguish between two different ways to solve the task. One is that if you do the drawing and you want to interrupt in the middle of the drawing, then that takes age. I mean, for that the child needs to be more mature. But there are easier ways to solve the task, and that is by adding something at the end. And this is even younger children can do it under different circumstances, and we have shown that. So it's not clear cut what's the route between being aware and procedural abilities in terms of representational redescription theory.
Right.
So these are just these two topics.
Okay.
One is mirror drawing, and this is the
Right. Okay. I mean, the recency effect being what it is, I'll take the second one first. So I do think there are often strategies where you can turn a hard task into an easy task. Whether or not children are able to come up with a strategy to do that is a different line of development, I think, probably from the line of development that you actually want to study, so to speak. But it's an interesting one because coming up with a strategy, of course, is wonderful, and etc. So to illustrate that with perspective taking, the way you can turn Piaget's picture task into an easy task where you don't have to so much inhibit all these competing representations is to basically ask yourself an item question. Unless the experimenters have been mean and evil enough to scramble some of the internal relations, which usually they don't do. Usually they just show you the view from here, the view from here, the view from here, the view from here. So if there's no scrambling, all you have to do is ask yourself the question, if I were over there, what would be in front? Okay, let me find a picture where that's in front. So on some level, that's cheating, but it's very smart. And actually, occasionally 4-year-olds can do that. But that just illustrates kind of a theme of mine, which is this, the idea, one of the things I hate the developmentalists often say, and I'm sometimes guilty of this myself, is that at age X, children can Y. This is almost never true. It can't be true. First of all, because there's a lot of individual variations. So, some 3-year-olds, some 5-year-olds, whatever, it's a little different, but also because thing X can fairly easily, I think, usually be made harder or easier. And that's information. And the question becomes, what are you most likely to need to do in the real world, in real life? And so, I mean, that's one kind of question. It's probably the most important kind of question for adaptation. It's the most important kind of question if you're trying to do something in a classroom, that kind of thing. But I think you can always shove this around pretty much. In terms of the first question, mirror drawing is really hard. And I don't know. I mean, the idea, I'm not sure it has, I don't know much about it, to tell you the truth. Has it ever been looked at with regard to mental rotation? It doesn't feel to me like it's mentally rotating. That isn't how I would do it.
Clearly not developmentally, otherwise I would have known.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure, you have to look all the literature through from age M onwards. but
Right.
maybe, I don't know, maybe someone of the audience knows.
I mean, the
whether-
fact that HM could learn it, right?
Yes.
I mean, that tells me it's something different, I think. It's somehow embodied. See this, do this opposite thing. See this, do this opposite thing. And you get enough routines that you just can run them. Is that it?
It's procedural.
Yeah, exactly.
But mental rotation is also, you need to experience it, and it's in a sense also procedural.
But then you have to judge it. See, that's what the Shepard-Metzler task is about. The mirror tracing would be like Shepard-Metzler if you showed somebody's effort to mirror trace and asked them, is this a good effort?
Mhm. That's true.
Yeah.
So it's about judgment rather than about
Right.
doing something. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Are there any more questions? Okay. Gal? Gal, yes. Gal, please. No, you already.
Yeah.
Okay. So let us thank the speaker again.
Thank you so much. This is a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. And I remind all of you that we have at 8 o'clock the surprise, the exciting, the mission that we all have to do. And we hope to see you at 8 o'clock again. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.